There's nothing more dangerous than a man with nothing left to lose. Sometimes the worst thing you can do to someone isn't killing them. It's taking away everything they've ever loved and leaving them breathing. In 1874, the Vásquez cartel rode into New Mexico looking for easy targets and quick money. They found Silas Donovan's small farm tucked away in the desert hills. Silas was a giant of a man who kept to himself after the war, tending his land and caring for his aging uncle. The cartel thought he looked like an easy mark. They burned his crops, stole his cattle, and shot his uncle dead in front of his eyes. Then they rode away, laughing and counting their coins, thinking they'd never see that lonely farm again. They were wrong. What they had done was wake up something dark and patient that would hunt them for the next 10 years. One by one, cartel members began disappearing in the night. But how does one broken man take down an entire criminal empire? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Donovan farm as Silas emerged from the modest adobe house, his massive frame filling the doorway like a mountain emerging from mist. At 6 feet 8 inches tall, with shoulders that seemed carved from the same red stone that dotted the New Mexico landscape, he was a man who commanded attention simply by existing. Yet in the years since the war ended, he had chosen the quietest possible life. Tucked away in these desert hills, where a man could hear his own thoughts and forget the thunder of cannons. Uncle Samuel was already at work in the vegetable garden, his weathered hands gentle with the tomato plants, despite the arthritis that had begun to bend his fingers like old tree roots. At 73, Samuel Donovan possessed the kind of wisdom that comes not from books, but from decades of watching seasons change and understanding that everything in life, both good and bad, passes in its time. His Confederate Army medal, tarnished now and kept in a small wooden box on the kitchen table, served as a daily reminder of violence that Silas had tried desperately to leave behind. Morning, "Uncle," Silas called out, his voice deep as a canyon echo. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, each step deliberate and measured. The war had taught him to be aware of his surroundings, to notice the small changes that might signal danger. But out here those skills had softened into a farmer's intuition about weather and soil and the health of his small herd of cattle. Samuel looked up from his work, squinting against the morning light. "Coffee's still warm on the stove, nephew. Figured you might want some before we check the south pasture fence." The routine was as comfortable as an old pair of boots. For 3 years now, since Silas had drifted back to the family land, like a wounded animal seeking shelter, they had fallen into this rhythm. Morning coffee shared in companionable silence. The day's work divided between them according to strength and preference. Evenings spent on the front porch with Samuel reading aloud from his worn Bible while Silas whittled small figures from desert. Ironwood. Silas poured himself coffee from the blue enamel pot and stepped back outside, breathing in the clean desert air. This was peace, something he had never expected to find again after Gettysburg. After watching friends torn apart by cannon fire, after coming home to find his parents dead from fever and the family farm nearly lost to debt. Samuel had saved the land, worked it alone for years, waiting for his nephew to find his way back home. "Fence looks solid from here," Silas observed, shading his eyes to look across the pasture where their small herd grazed contentedly. 23 head of cattle, not enough to make them wealthy, but sufficient to keep food on the table and pay the modest taxes that came due each year. It was an honest living, earned through sweat and careful planning rather than violence or cunning. Samuel wiped dirt from his hands on his canvas work pants. "Honest work for honest men," he said, as if reading his nephew's thoughts. "The Lord provides for those who provide for themselves." The older man's faith had remained unshaken through decades of hardship. Even when his own son, Silas's father, had marched off to war and never returned. Even when drought had nearly broken them in 71, Samuel maintained his belief that a man's character was measured not by what happened to him, but by how he responded to what happened. His faith was simple and practical, built on the understanding that kindness and hard work were the foundations of a decent life. "Been thinking we might expand the garden next spring," Samuel continued, gesturing toward a patch of unused ground near the house. "Ground's good there. Gets morning sun but has shade in the afternoon heat. Could grow enough vegetables to sell some in town." Silas nodded, though he noticed his uncle's slight tremor as he pointed, age creeping in despite the old man's determined vitality. At 42, Silas felt ancient himself some days, worn down by memories and the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from seeing too much death too young. But working beside Samuel, watching seasons change and crops grow, had begun to heal something inside him that he had thought permanently broken. The nearest town, Socorro, lay 15 miles to the east, close enough for monthly supply runs, but far enough away that neighbors were a rare sight. This isolation suited Silas perfectly. In town, people stared at his size and whispered about his silence, inventing stories about what he had done during the war. Better to let them wonder than to tell them the truth about Antietam and Fredericksburg, about the way artillery could turn living men into red mist, about nights spent burying boys who should have grown up to be farmers and fathers. But the isolation that protected Silas from unwanted questions also left them vulnerable in other ways. The territory had grown dangerous in recent years as various criminal organizations pushed north from Mexico, taking advantage of the sparse law enforcement and vast, empty spaces to establish smuggling routes and hideouts. The Vásquez cartel had become particularly notorious, led by a man named Don Emilio Vásquez, who ruled through fear and systematic brutality. Local Mexican families spoke of them in whispers, crossing themselves and looking over their shoulders even in daylight. American settlers had begun abandoning remote homesteads, moving closer to established towns where numbers might provide safety. But Samuel refused to be driven from land his family had worked for over 20 years. And Silas had nowhere else to go even if he wanted to leave. "Heard talk in town last month about trouble moving this way," Samuel said quietly, as if the morning's peace had reminded him of shadows gathering beyond their small sanctuary. "Folks saying the Vásquez bunch has been pushing further north, demanding tribute from anyone they find." Silas felt his jaw tighten involuntarily. How close? Close enough that the Martinez family packed up and moved to Albuquerque. "Their place is only 8 miles south of us." Samuel's voice carried the weight of a man who had seen enough of life to recognize when storms were building on the horizon. "Might be we should consider our options." But even as he said it, both men knew they would not run. This land held the bones of Silas's parents, the memories of his childhood, the only peace he had found since the war ended. Samuel had invested too many years and too much love in this place to abandon it to criminals. They were not the kind of men who yielded to threats, even when wisdom might have counseled retreat. The morning work proceeded as usual, checking the cattle, mending a broken gate hinge, clearing irrigation channels of accumulated debris. By midday, when the sun had climbed high enough to make labor uncomfortable, they retreated to the shade of the house for lunch and the brief rest that desert dwellers learned to take during the heat of the day. Samuel pulled out his Bible and opened it to a passage he had been studying, his lips moving silently as he read. The book was nearly worn through from decades of use, its leather cover soft as cloth and many of its pages loose from their binding. It was the same Bible his father had carried from Tennessee when the family first came west, the same book that had provided comfort during the worst moments of his life. Silas watched his uncle read and felt a familiar mixture of envy and affection. He had lost his own faith somewhere in the red mud of Virginia, but he envied Samuel's certainty, his ability to find meaning and purpose in Scripture, even when the world seemed determined to reward cruelty and punish decency. Uncle Samuel's faith was not the loud, showy kind that some men used to impress their neighbors, but the quiet, practical sort that showed itself in daily kindness and unshakable moral conviction. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, they returned to their work. There was always something that needed attention on a working farm, tools to be maintained, animals to be tended, structures to be repaired or improved. The work was hard but satisfying, the kind that left a man tired in his body but peaceful in his mind. Evening found them on the front porch as usual, the day's heat finally beginning to fade from the air. Samuel read aloud while Silas worked on a small wooden horse he was carving, his large hands surprisingly delicate with the sharp knife. The reading was from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. Words that seemed particularly appropriate as they watched the sun sink toward the western mountains. This was the life Silas had built from the wreckage of his youth, simple, honest, and peaceful. He had learned to appreciate small pleasures, the taste of water from their well, the sound of wind through the cottonwoods, the sight of Uncle Samuel's weathered face creased in concentration as he read. It was not the life he had imagined as a young man, but it was a good life, earned through suffering and maintained through daily choice. Neither man could have known that this particular evening would be their last together, that the peace they had carefully constructed was about to be shattered by men who measured their worth in fear and counted their success in other people's pain. The storm that Samuel had sensed building on the horizon was closer than either of them realized, and tomorrow would bring visitors who understood only one language, the language of violence and domination. But for now, in the gathering dusk of what would prove to be their final peaceful evening together, they simply existed in the moment, uncle and nephew, survivor and guardian. Two men who had found in each other and in this harsh but beautiful land a reason to keep believing that goodness might yet triumph over evil, that quiet decency might yet prove stronger than loud brutality. The wooden horse in Silas's hands was nearly finished, its carved features emerging from the ironwood with each careful cut of his knife. It would join the small collection of figures he had made over the years, horses and cattle, eagles and coyotes, all the creatures that shared this desert landscape with them. They were his way of capturing and preserving the beauty he saw around him, of creating something lasting and peaceful from his own hands. Uncle Samuel's voice rose and fell with the ancient rhythms of Scripture, his words carrying across the desert air like a prayer or benediction. In the distance, coyotes began their evening song, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. It was a moment of perfect peace, the kind that men like Silas learned to treasure, because they understood how rare and fragile such moments truly were. Tomorrow would bring the test of everything they had built together, everything they believed about the possibility of living quietly and decently in a world that often rewarded neither quality. But tonight, there was only the carved horse taking shape in Silas's hands, Samuel's steady voice reading ancient wisdom, and the vast desert silence that held them both like a blessing. The riders appeared on the southern horizon just after dawn, their silhouettes wavering in the heat shimmer like figures from a fever dream. Silas spotted them first while checking the morning irrigation, his war-trained eyes immediately cataloguing details. 12 men, well-armed, moving with the practiced coordination of those accustomed to violence. The burnt family photograph tucked in his shirt pocket, a charred remnant of his parents' wedding day, seemed to grow heavier against his chest. "Uncle Samuel," he called quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded storms. "We have visitors." Samuel emerged from the chicken coop, a basket of fresh eggs in his weathered hands. He followed Silas's gaze to the approaching riders and felt his stomach tighten with recognition. Even at this distance, the red bandanas and distinctive silver conchos on their saddles marked them clearly as Vásquez men. He had hoped they would pass by, that their small farm would prove too insignificant to warrant attention. "Perhaps they're just passing through," Samuel said, though his voice carried little conviction. He set the egg basket carefully on the porch steps and moved to stand beside his nephew, drawing what comfort he could from Silas's imposing presence. The riders drew closer, and their leader became clear, a lean man with cruel eyes and a mustache waxed to sharp points. Captain Rodriguez Mendoza, Don Emilio's most trusted lieutenant, a man whose reputation for creative brutality had spread throughout the territory. The silver cross, hanging from his neck, caught the morning sunlight, a mockery of faith worn by one who understood only the religion of fear. They reined up in the farmyard in a cloud of dust, their horses snorting and stamping with barely controlled energy. Mendoza's smile revealed teeth stained brown from tobacco, and his eyes moved over the modest buildings and well-tended fields with the calculating gaze of a man appraising someone else's property. "Buenos dias." "Señores," Mendoza said, his English accented but precise. "I am Captain Mendoza of the Vásquez organization. We have come to discuss business arrangements with the landowners in this area." Silas stepped slightly forward, placing himself between the riders and his uncle. At his full height, he towered over even the mounted men, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the dusty ground. "This is private property," he said quietly. "You're welcome to water your horses and move on." Mendoza's laugh was like the sound of glass breaking. "Ah, the giant speaks. Yes, we have heard stories about you, Señor Donovan. A veteran of the Confederate Army, no? A man who knows something about killing." His eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "But that war is over, and this is a new territory with new rules. What do you want?" Samuel asked, his voice steady despite the fear that had begun to crawl up his spine like a cold snake. "Want? We want nothing unreasonable. Simply recognition of certain realities." Mendoza dismounted with fluid grace, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "This land sits on roots important to our business operations. We require assurance that those who live here understand their responsibilities to contribute to the peace and prosperity of the region." The euphemisms were as thin as smoke, but Silas understood the message perfectly. Protection money paid to criminals in exchange for the privilege of not being murdered in their sleep. He had seen similar arrangements during the war, where Confederate units had demanded tribute from civilian populations. It always started with reasonable requests and polite language, but it always ended in blood. "We're simple farmers," Silas said carefully. "We don't have money for tribute." "Tribute?" Mendoza's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Such an ugly word. We prefer to think of it as a business partnership. You provide a modest monthly contribution, say $50, and we ensure that your property remains safe from the many dangers that plague isolated homesteads." $50 was more than they made in 3 months of good farming. It might as well have been 50,000. Silas felt his jaw clench, the familiar tension that had once preceded battlefield violence. Beside him, Samuel stepped forward with the kind of quiet courage that had carried him through 7 decades of hardship. "Young man," Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority of age and righteousness, "we are God-fearing people who work honest land with honest labor. We have no quarrel with you or your organization, but we will not be extorted by criminals." The words hung in the morning air like a challenge thrown down between enemies. Mendoza's smile never wavered, but something cold and deadly flickered behind his eyes. He drew his pistol with casual precision, the barrel catching the sunlight as it swung toward Samuel's chest. "Old man," Mendoza said softly, "you have just made a very expensive mistake." Silas moved then, his massive frame uncoiling like a spring released. But even his war-honed reflexes could not cover the distance between them faster than Mendoza could pull a trigger. The gunshot cracked across the desert like thunder, and Samuel Donovan crumpled to the ground with a spreading red stain across his white shirt. "Uncle!" Silas's roar of anguish and rage seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. He lunged toward Mendoza, but 3 rifles swung to cover him, held by men who understood the practical mathematics of violence. "Careful, giant," Mendoza warned, his smoking pistol now pointed at Silas's chest. "Your uncle died for his pride. No need for you to join him quite yet." Silas dropped to his knees beside Samuel, gathering the dying man into his arms. Blood bubbled on his uncle's lips as he tried to speak, his eyes already growing dim with approaching death. The burnt photograph fell from Silas's pocket, landing in the spreading pool of blood. the last image of his parents' happiness now soaked in his uncle's sacrifice. "Silas," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. "Remember what I taught you about forgiveness. Don't let hate consume what goodness remains in your heart." Those were his final words. Samuel Donovan died in his nephew's arms, his weathered hand still clutching the worn Bible that had sustained him through decades of faith and hardship. The morning sun seemed to dim as his spirit passed, leaving behind only the cooling shell of a man who had tried to live by principles in a world that increasingly punished such devotion. Mendoza holstered his pistol and gestured to his men. "Burn it," he ordered with casual indifference. "All of it. Let this serve as an example to others who might be tempted to refuse our generous offers." They moved through the property like locusts, torching the crops, driving off the cattle, setting fire to the modest buildings that had sheltered 3 generations of Donovans. The flames leaped hungrily from roof to roof, consuming in minutes what had taken years to build. The vegetable garden where Samuel had worked that very morning was trampled into mud, his careful cultivation destroyed by careless boots. Silas remained kneeling in the dirt, holding his uncle's body while the world burned around him. The riders seemed almost respectful of his grief, keeping their distance from the giant who held death in his arms. Even hardened killers could recognize the kind of sorrow that might drive a man to acts beyond reason. "You have 24 hours to bury your dead and leave this territory," Mendoza announced as his men finished their destruction. "If we find you here after that, you will join him. And Senor Donovan, if you are wise, you will forget what happened here. Some battles cannot be won by one man, no matter how large." They rode away as suddenly as they had come, leaving behind only smoke and ash and the broken giant cradling his murdered uncle. The family photograph, now thoroughly soaked in blood, had become unrecognizable, just another casualty of senseless violence. For hours, Silas did not move. He sat in the ruins of his life, holding the only family he had left in the world, while the desert wind fanned the flames that consumed everything he had called home. The carved wooden horse he had been working on the night before lay smashed beneath a horse's hoof, its careful details obliterated by careless violence. As the sun reached its zenith, Silas finally stirred. He lifted Samuel's body with infinite gentleness and carried him to the small family cemetery behind what had been their house. With his bare hands, he dug a grave in the hard desert soil, his tears mixing with sweat and ash as he prepared his uncle's final resting place. The burial was a simple affair, just Silas and the desert wind, and the bitter taste of ashes in the air. He spoke no words over the grave, having no faith left to offer comfort to the dead. Instead, he knelt in the dirt and made a different kind of vow, one that had nothing to do with forgiveness or turning the other cheek. Captain Rodriguez Mendoza and his 12 riders had made the gravest mistake of their violent lives. They had awakened something in Silas Donovan that he had tried desperately to keep buried, the cold, calculating killer that the war had created and that years of peace had almost tamed. Uncle Samuel's final words about forgiveness echoed in his mind, but they were drowned out by a darker voice that spoke of justice and retribution. The Vásquez cartel had wanted to teach a lesson about the consequences of defying their authority. Instead, they had just enrolled themselves in a different kind of school entirely, one where the tuition was paid in blood and the graduation rate was 0. The grave was finished by sunset, marked only by a simple wooden cross that Silas carved from a piece of charred timber. Uncle Samuel's hunting rifle, rescued from the ruins of their burned home, leaned against the makeshift headstone like a metal flower left by a mourner. The weapon had survived the fire, its steel barrel blackened but functional, a tool that would serve a very different purpose in the days to come. Silas knelt beside the fresh mound of earth, his massive hands folded in what might have been prayer if he still possessed any faith to offer. The desert wind carried the acrid smell of smoke and ash, reminders of everything that had been taken from him in a single morning. Around him, the skeletal remains of buildings stood like broken teeth against the darkening sky. "I'm sorry, Uncle," he whispered to the silent grave. "I couldn't protect you, but I swear on your memory they will pay for what they've done." The words felt strange in his mouth. He had not spoken of vengeance since the war ended, had tried to bury that part of himself as deeply as he now buried Samuel. But grief and rage were poor soil for growing forgiveness. And what sprouted in their place was something darker and more patient than simple anger. He spent the night sitting vigil beside the grave, his mind working through the practical problems of what came next. Mendoza had given him 24 hours to leave, but Silas had no intention of running. This land held the bones of his family, the memories of the only peace he had known since the war. More importantly, leaving would mean that Samuel's death served its intended purpose, to teach others that defying the Vásquez cartel carried a price too high to pay. As dawn broke over the desert, Silas rose stiffly from his long vigil and began the work of transformation. The peaceful farmer who had tended crops and carved wooden animals was dead, buried alongside Uncle Samuel in the hard New Mexico soil. What remained was something the war had forged and grief had tempered, a weapon pointed at the heart of the organization that had destroyed his world. His first task was gathering intelligence. The cartel operated throughout a vast territory, but they were not ghosts. They needed supplies, safe houses, reliable routes between their various enterprises. Men like Mendoza left tracks that could be followed by someone with the right skills and sufficient patience. The ruins of his home yielded several useful items: Samuel's rifle and ammunition, a pair of field glasses that had belonged to his father, a heavy knife suitable for close work, and most importantly, a hand-drawn map of the local territory that marked water sources, game trails, and the locations of isolated homesteads. The map would serve as the foundation for tracking the cartel's movements and identifying their patterns. Silas studied the surrounding terrain with the eye of a military tactician. The desert provided excellent cover for a man who understood its rhythms. Vast distances where sound carried for miles, rocky outcroppings that offered concealment, arroyos and canyons that could hide a small army. It was harsh country that killed the unprepared. But for someone with the right knowledge and equipment, it could serve as an invisible highway. His first expedition took him south toward the Martinez farm that Samuel had mentioned, the family who had abandoned their land rather than face the cartel's demands. The abandoned homestead told its own story of fear and flight, doors left standing open, personal belongings scattered as if the family had packed only what they could carry in desperate haste. But more importantly, the site showed clear evidence of recent cartel activity. Horse tracks circled the buildings, and Silas found the remains of a campfire where riders had stopped to rest. Cigarette butts and empty bottles suggested they had lingered here, perhaps using the abandoned buildings as a way station between other destinations. He followed the tracks southeast, moving carefully through terrain that offered little cover during daylight hours. The trail led him to a well-used path that ran parallel to an old creek bed, clearly a route the cartel used regularly for moving between their various operations. Silas memorized landmarks and distances, building a mental map of their network that would prove invaluable in the months to come. 3 days of careful observation revealed the pattern he had suspected. The cartel operated on a schedule, with groups of riders moving along established routes at predictable intervals. They were confident in their dominance of the territory, confident enough to become careless about security measures that might have protected them from a more conventional enemy. But Silas was not a conventional enemy. The war had taught him the value of patience, the importance of gathering intelligence before striking, the deadly effectiveness of irregular warfare against a superior force. He had helped hunt Confederate guerrillas through the forests of Virginia. Now he would apply those same lessons from the opposite perspective. His first direct contact with the cartel came on a moonless night when a 3-man patrol stopped to water their horses at a spring near the old Martinez place. Silas had been watching the location for 2 days, noting that riders frequently used it as a rest stop during their circuits through the territory. He moved through the darkness like a ghost made flesh, his massive frame somehow becoming part of the desert landscape. Years of hunting game in these hills had taught him where to step to avoid loose rocks, how to use the wind to mask any sound of his passage. The sentries never saw him coming. The first man died silently, Silas's powerful hands breaking his neck before he could cry out. The second managed to draw his pistol, but never had the chance to fire it. The heavy knife took him in the chest, piercing his heart with surgical precision. The third rider tried to run, but made it less than 20 yards before Silas brought him down with a thrown rock that shattered his skull. It was over in less than 2 minutes. 3 experienced killers eliminated by one man, who had learned the art of death in a harder school than any of them had attended. Silas felt no satisfaction in their deaths, only a cold sense of completion, the first payment on a debt that would take years to collect in full. He arranged the bodies in a specific pattern, one that would send a clear message to whoever found them. Each man was left sitting upright against a rock, their weapons arranged in their laps, their eyes closed, as if they had simply decided to take a nap in the desert. Around each body, Silas placed small stones in a circle, a symbol that would mean nothing to most people, but would be recognized by anyone familiar with Native American burial practices. The message was simple, but profound. The desert itself had claimed these men, swallowed them up as punishment for their crimes against the land and its people. It was the beginning of a legend that would grow with each passing month, the story of a giant who moved through the wilderness like an avenging spirit. When the bodies were discovered 3 days later by another cartel patrol, the effect was exactly what Silas had intended. Hardened criminals who feared nothing on earth found themselves looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows, wondering what kind of enemy could kill 3 armed men without making a sound. The weapons and horses he kept, building a cache of supplies that would sustain him through the long campaign ahead. Each rifle represented increased firepower. Each horse offered mobility and the option of carrying additional equipment. More importantly, every weapon taken from the cartel was one less that could be used against innocent civilians. Silas established his base camp in a hidden canyon 10 miles from the ruins of his farm, a place where ancient waters had carved a deep gouge in the red rock that was invisible from ground level until you stood at its very edge. A spring provided fresh water year-round, and the high walls offered protection from both weather and observation. Here he began the patient work of becoming a legend. Each night brought new reconnaissance, new intelligence about cartel movements and operations. Each week brought new opportunities to strike, always silently, always unexpectedly, always leaving behind the same mysterious calling card that had marked his first kills. The cartel began to adapt, sending out larger patrols and varying their routes. But adaptation took time, and every change in their procedures created new vulnerabilities that a patient observer could exploit. Silas had learned during the war that the key to irregular warfare was forcing the enemy to react to your initiatives rather than pursuing their own objectives. Within a month, the Vásquez organization found itself devoting significant resources to protecting itself from an enemy they could not find, could not fight, and could not understand. The ghost giant had become more than a nuisance. He was becoming a genuine threat to their operations. And in his hidden canyon, surrounded by the weapons of dead men, Silas Donovan began to plan the next phase of his war. 3 months into his campaign, Silas had collected 17 silver crosses from the necks of dead cartel members. Each necklace represented a life taken in payment for Uncle Samuel's murder, and he kept them in a leather pouch that had once held his uncle's tobacco. The crosses clinked softly when he moved, a metallic prayer that followed him through the desert like the whisper of approaching judgment. The cartel's response had evolved from confusion to genuine fear. Captain Mendoza had tripled the size of patrol groups and instituted new security protocols, but the phantom in the desert seemed to anticipate every countermeasure. Men who had terrorized entire villages now rode in tight formations, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for threats that never appeared until it was too late. Silas had become a student of his enemies, learning their individual habits and weaknesses through patient observation. Miguel Santos always dismounted to relieve himself behind the same cluster of rocks near Agua Fria Canyon. Carlos Herrera carried his rifle carelessly, the barrel often clogged with dust from his habit of resting it on the ground. Eduardo Vega's horse favored its left rear leg, making him slower than his companions during rapid movement. These small details became the foundation for larger strategies. Silas knew which men could be separated from their groups, which routes they preferred during different weather conditions, which leaders commanded genuine respect versus those who ruled through fear alone. The intelligence he gathered was written in a careful, hand on pieces of paper hidden throughout his canyon hideout, a military intelligence operation conducted by an army of one. His methods had evolved beyond simple ambush and assassination. Psychological warfare proved equally effective against men whose confidence depended on maintaining an image of invincibility. Cartel members would wake to find their horses' manes braided with wildflowers, or discover that someone had rearranged their equipment while they slept without disturbing the sentries. These incidents served no tactical purpose beyond demonstrating that their mysterious enemy could reach them anywhere, any time he chose. The psychological pressure began to show in their behavior. Fights broke out between patrol members over imagined slights and perceived cowardice. Some men requested transfers to other territories, claiming family emergencies or personal business that required their immediate attention. Others began wearing religious amulets and crossing themselves. Before mounting their horses each morning, local Mexican villagers had begun to whisper stories about El Gigante, Phantasma, the ghost giant who moved through the desert like a vengeful spirit. The tales grew with each telling, describing a figure 8 feet tall who could disappear into solid rock and whose eyes glowed red in the darkness. Mothers used his name to frighten children into obedience, and grown men crossed themselves when his shadow supposedly fell across their path. Silas encouraged these stories through carefully staged encounters with civilians. He would appear briefly at the edge of a village, just long enough to be seen, always at sunset when the light played tricks with perspective and made him seem even larger than his natural impressive size. Sometimes he left small gifts, food for hungry families, medicine for the sick, silver coins for those in desperate need, always vanishing before questions could be asked or thanks offered. The gifts came from cartel members who no longer had need of earthly possessions. Silas had developed an efficient system for processing his kills, stripping them of anything useful before arranging their bodies in the distinctive seated position that had become his signature. Money and supplies were redistributed to the civilians who suffered most under cartel oppression, while weapons and ammunition joined his growing arsenal. His fourth major engagement came when he intercepted a supply convoy traveling between cartel strongholds. 6 armed guards escorted a wagon loaded with weapons, ammunition, and silver coins, the monthly tribute collected from terrorized villagers throughout the territory. The guards were experienced fighters, alert and well-positioned for mutual support. Silas spent 2 days studying their route and timing, identifying the optimal location for an ambush. A narrow passage between high rocks forced the convoy into single file, while a dry streambed offered concealed approach routes from multiple directions. Most importantly, the terrain would muffle gunshots and prevent any survivors from calling for help. He struck just before dawn, when human alertness reaches its lowest ebb. The lead guard died instantly when a thrown knife opened his throat, while the driver found himself facing the barrel of a rifle that seemed to have materialized from empty air. The remaining guards tried to organize a defense, but found themselves caught between crossfires from positions that logic said could not be occupied by a single man. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 6 more silver crosses joined Silas's collection, and a wagon load of cartel resources had been redistributed to serve justice rather than oppression. But more importantly, the psychological impact of losing an entire convoy to one man sent shockwaves through the organization that no amount of conventional military pressure could have achieved. Captain Mendoza's response was swift and brutal. Unable to find the ghost giant who haunted his operations, he took his frustration out on the civilian population. Villages suspected of harboring or assisting the phantom faced collective punishment. Buildings burned, livestock slaughtered, leaders publicly executed as examples to others who might be tempted to support resistance against cartel authority. The escalation troubled Silas more than he had expected. His war against the cartel was producing unintended consequences for the very people he sought to protect. Uncle Samuel's voice echoed in his memory, warning about the price of vengeance and the importance of considering collateral damage before taking action. But the alternative, allowing the cartel to operate without opposition, seemed even worse. Every day they remained in power meant more families terrorized, more young men recruited into lives of violence, more communities held hostage by criminals who recognized no law except their own brutal self-interest. Sometimes the only way to protect innocence was to become something that innocence could not understand or approve. Silas modified his tactics to account for the increased danger to civilians. Instead of simply killing cartel members and leaving their bodies to be found, he began making them disappear entirely. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves scattered throughout the desert, leaving behind only questions and growing paranoia among the survivors. The disappearances proved even more effective than the symbolic killings had been. Men could rationalize death as an occupational hazard, but total vanishment suggested supernatural forces beyond human understanding. Cartel members began to believe they were fighting not just a man, but some kind of desert demon that consumed souls as well as bodies. Recruitment became increasingly difficult as the cartel's reputation for invincibility crumbled. Young men, who might once have seen membership as a path to power and wealth, now viewed it as a death sentence, delivered by an enemy who could not be fought or reasoned with. Established members requested transfers to other territories, and some simply abandoned their posts without explanation. The silver crosses in Silas's pouch numbered 23 by winter's end. Each one represented not just a personal victory, but a small reduction in the cartel's ability to terrorize innocent people. Yet the collection also served as a reminder of how far he had traveled from the man who once carved wooden animals in the evening light, while his uncle read scripture aloud. The ghost giant had become real, and there was no returning to the peaceful farmer who had died beside Uncle Samuel's grave. 6 months had passed since Uncle Samuel's murder, and the hand-drawn map of cartel territory spread across Silas's makeshift table bore 43 red X marks. Each mark represented a confirmed kill, a life taken in the patient pursuit of justice that had consumed his existence. The map itself had evolved into a masterpiece of military intelligence, covered with notes about patrol routes, safe houses, supply lines, and the personal habits of key cartel leaders. Captain Rodrigo Vásquez, son of Don Emilio and heir to the cartel empire, stood in his father's study examining reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. 37 of his men had vanished without a trace over the past 6 months. Another dozen had requested transfers to other territories, claiming family emergencies that fooled no one. Recruitment had dropped to almost nothing as stories of the ghost giant spread throughout the region. "This phantom is destroying our operations," Rodrigo said, his voice tight with frustration. At 28, he possessed his father's intelligence, but lacked the older man's casual cruelty. The cartel business had been built on fear and violence, but Rodrigo sometimes wondered if there might be more sustainable ways to maintain power. "Our tribute collections are down 40% because families are abandoning their homes rather than risk attracting his attention." Don Emilio Vásquez looked up from his evening meal, his eyes cold as winter stones. At 62, he had built his empire through decades of careful planning and ruthless execution. The idea that one man could threaten everything he had created struck him as both impossible and personally insulting. One man, my son. One man is not an army, no matter how large or how clever. He bleeds like any other man, and when he bleeds enough, he dies. The elder Vásquez's voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had solved similar problems many times before. We simply have not been creative enough in our approach. Rodrigo spread a territorial map across his father's desk, marking the locations where their men had disappeared. The pattern showed clear intelligence and planning. The ghost giant was not striking randomly, but targeting specific individuals and operations with surgical precision. He knows our routes, our schedules, our personnel. This is not some angry farmer seeking simple revenge. This is someone with military training conducting an organized campaign. The realization troubled Rodrigo more than he cared to admit. Random violence could be countered with superior firepower, but intelligent opposition required a more sophisticated response. Worse, the ghost giant's methods were turning their own reputation for invincibility against them. Every unexplained disappearance added to his legend while diminishing their authority. Don Emilio's solution was characteristically direct. "Bring in Cazador," he ordered, referring to a half-Apache tracker whose skills had earned him a fearsome reputation throughout the Southwest. If this phantom exists in the physical world, Cazador can find him. And once found, he can be killed like any other man. Meanwhile, in his hidden canyon, Silas prepared for the next phase of his campaign. The red X marks on his map formed a rough circle around the cartel's primary stronghold in the Organ Mountains, where Don Emilio maintained his headquarters in a fortified compound that had once been a Spanish mission. Attacking the stronghold directly would be suicide, but systematic elimination of its outlying support network might force the leadership into making mistakes. His most recent intelligence, who had come from interrogating a wounded cartel accountant whose horse had thrown him in a remote canyon. The man, delirious from pain and fever, had revealed the locations of 3 major weapons caches and the schedule for the next tribute collection run from the mining town of Hillsborough. The information would allow Silas to strike multiple targets in rapid succession, creating the impression that he could be in several places simultaneously. The interrogation had also revealed disturbing information about the cartel's expansion plans. Don Emilio was negotiating alliances with criminal organizations in Arizona and Texas, seeking to create a network that would span the entire Southwest. Success would mean hundreds of additional fighters and resources that could overwhelm even the most determined individual resistance. Silas studied the territorial map by lamplight, calculating distances and timing for his next series of operations. The weapons caches would be relatively easy targets, isolated storage sites guarded by only 2 or 3 men. The tribute collection presented a more complex challenge, but offered proportionally greater rewards. Disrupting the flow of money would hurt the cartel's operations more than killing individual members. His planning was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Maria Santos, a young Mexican woman whose husband had been murdered by cartel enforcers, had somehow found her way to his hidden canyon. She stood at the entrance like a figure from a fever dream, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight as she spoke in accented English. "Señor Fantasma," she said, using the name that Mexican villagers had given him, "I have come to ask for your help, but also to bring you a warning. The cartel has hired Cazador to hunt you. He is already following your trail." Silas emerged from the shadows, his massive frame causing the woman to step back involuntarily. He had heard of Cazador, a tracker whose mixed Apache heritage had given him skills that bordered on the supernatural. If the cartel had brought him into the conflict, the rules of the game were about to change dramatically. "Why do you risk coming here?" Silas asked, his voice carrying the roughness of months spent mostly in solitude. "Association with me will mark you for death." Maria's chin lifted with defiant pride. My husband died trying to protect our village from these animals. His death will mean nothing if their power continues to grow. You are the only hope we have for justice." She handed him a small leather pouch containing detailed intelligence about the cartel's operations, information gathered by a network of Mexican families who had lost loved ones to cartel violence, guard schedules, supply routes, personal information about key leaders, and most importantly, a detailed layout of Don Emilio's mountain stronghold. "There are others who support your war," Maria continued. "Families who have lost everything, young men who refuse to join the cartel, old people who remember when this land was governed by law instead of fear. We cannot fight as you fight, but we can watch and listen and remember." The revelation that he had unconscious allies throughout the territory changed Silas's strategic calculations. A network of civilian intelligence sources could provide information that no amount of personal reconnaissance could gather. More importantly, it suggested that his campaign was having effects beyond simple body counts. He was inspiring resistance, rather than merely creating fear, but the presence of Cazador on his trail meant that his period of invisible operations was ending. The Apache tracker would follow signs that other men could not see, interpret clues that would mean nothing to conventional pursuers. Soon the hunt would become mutual, with both predator and prey adapting to new realities. Silas spent the remainder of the night relocating his base camp to a more defensible position deeper in the canyon system. If Cazador was truly as skilled as reputation suggested, the hidden sanctuary that had protected him for months might become a trap. The war was entering a new phase, one that would test not just his ability to kill, but his capacity to survive against an enemy who understood the desert as well as he did. As dawn broke over the New Mexico landscape, the ghost giant began preparing for the most dangerous hunt of his life, one where he might find himself playing the role of prey rather than predator. 1 year had passed since Uncle Samuel's death, and Silas found himself holding the carved wooden horse that his uncle had been whittling on their last peaceful evening together. The small figure was unfinished, its legs only roughly shaped, and its mane merely suggested by careful knife cuts. It represented everything he had lost, not just family and home, but the possibility of a life built around creation rather than destruction. The toy horse had survived the fire that consumed their house, discovered weeks later buried under debris in what had been Samuel's workshop. Silas carried it now as a reminder of the man he had been before grief and rage transformed him into something that even he sometimes did not recognize. The unfinished carving served as both anchor and accusation, a tangible connection to values that seemed increasingly distant from his current existence. Cazador had been tracking him for 3 months, and the pursuit had forced Silas to abandon many of his established patterns. The Apache tracker was everything his reputation suggested: patient, intelligent, and possessed of skills that seemed to border on the supernatural. Twice Silas had narrowly escaped ambushes that would have ended his war permanently. The hunter had become the hunted, and the psychological pressure was beginning to show. The cartel's adaptation to his methods had also evolved beyond simple increased security. They now moved in larger groups, varied their routes randomly, and employed counter-surveillance techniques that made them much more difficult to track and engage. Rodrigo Vásquez had proven himself a capable adversary, studying Silas's tactics and developing countermeasures that limited his effectiveness. But the most troubling development was the cost being paid by innocent civilians. Don Emilio had ordered systematic retaliation against any village suspected of providing intelligence or support to the ghost giant. Families had been burned out of their homes, men had disappeared into cartel dungeons, and children had been orphaned in the name of discouraging resistance. Maria Santos had brought him news of the latest atrocity, the destruction of the village of San Miguel, where 23 people had been murdered because someone had reported seeing the ghost giant near their well. Among the dead were children too young to understand the adult conflicts that had claimed their lives. Their blood was on Silas's hands as surely as if he had pulled the triggers himself. "This is not justice," Maria said during one of their clandestine meetings in a remote canyon. "This is madness feeding on itself until there is nothing left but death and suffering. My husband would not have wanted this legacy." Her words echoed Uncle Samuel's final plea for forgiveness rather than vengeance. Silas found himself caught between his oath to make the cartel pay for their crimes and the growing realization that his methods were creating new victims faster than they were protecting old ones. The moral certainty that had sustained him through months of killing had begun to crack under the weight of unintended consequences. Yet abandoning his campaign seemed equally impossible. The cartel's power had grown during the year of conflict, their brutality spreading to new territories as they sought to demonstrate strength in the face of the ghost giant's challenge. Stopping now would mean that every life taken, every family destroyed, every child orphaned had been for nothing. The internal struggle was reflected in his physical condition. Months of constant vigilance and irregular meals had carved away flesh from his already lean frame, while stress and sleepless nights had etched new lines around his eyes. The giant, who had once seemed indestructible, was showing signs of mortality that even his enemies might have recognized as weakness. His most recent encounter with Cazador had nearly ended in disaster. The tracker had anticipated his approach to a cartel supply depot and positioned himself perfectly for an ambush. Only luck and the sudden appearance of a sandstorm had allowed Silas to escape, leaving behind equipment and intelligence that he could not afford to lose. The near miss had forced him to reconsider everything about his approach to the war. Fighting as a lone wolf had served him well initially, but the enemy had adapted to that model. Perhaps it was time to consider Maria's suggestion about building a more organized resistance, training and equipping local men who had lost family members to cartel violence. The idea troubled him for multiple reasons. Training civilians to fight meant accepting responsibility for their likely deaths. It also meant revealing himself to others, abandoning the anonymity that had been his greatest protection. Most significantly, it would transform his personal vendetta into something larger and more complex, a revolution that might outlive him but could also spiral beyond his control. But the alternative, continuing to operate alone while innocents paid the price for his vendetta, seemed increasingly untenable. Uncle Samuel's wooden horse seemed to reproach him with its unfinished state, suggesting that some things were more important than the satisfaction of personal revenge. His decision was catalyzed by news that Rodrigo Vásquez was planning a major expansion of cartel operations into Colorado territory. Success would mean hundreds of new recruits and access to silver mines that could fund a criminal empire spanning half the continent. The Ghost Giants campaign had slowed but not stopped the cartels. Growth, more dramatic action was required. Silas made contact with other men who had lost family members to cartel. The violence, farmers whose wives had been murdered, shopkeepers whose sons had been recruited by force, miners whose claims had been stolen at gunpoint. He found them scattered throughout the territory, nursing their grief in isolation and dreaming of revenge they lacked the skills or resources to achieve. The first meeting was held in an abandoned mine shaft 20 miles from the nearest settlement. 7 men gathered in the flickering light of oil lamps, their faces bearing the scars of loss and the hard determination of those who had nothing left to lose. Silas stood before them looking like the legend he had become, a giant carved from desert stone and tempered by months of solitary warfare. "I cannot promise you will survive," he told them bluntly. "I cannot promise we will succeed, but I can promise that if we do nothing, the cartel will continue to grow stronger while our families' deaths remain unavenged." The wooden horse in his pocket seemed to grow heavier as he spoke, reminding him of Uncle Samuel's teachings about forgiveness and the dangers of letting hatred consume the soul. But sometimes a man had to choose between competing moral imperatives, between the ideal of turning the other cheek and the reality of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The revolution that would ultimately destroy the Vásquez cartel began that night in a forgotten mineshaft, with 7 grieving men pledging their lives to a cause that might very well kill them all. The ghost giant had found his army, and the real war was about to begin. The hidden letter was discovered by accident when Silas returned to bury the wooden horse at Uncle Samuel's grave. A loose stone in the foundation of their burned home shifted under his weight, revealing a cavity that had protected its contents from the fire. Inside lay a leather portfolio containing correspondence that would change everything he thought he knew about his uncle's death. The papers were written in Samuel's careful handwriting, but they told the story of a man Silas had never known existed. For over 2 years, Uncle Samuel had been secretly corresponding with a network of Mexican revolutionaries who opposed the cartel's growing power. The peaceful farmer who read scripture each evening had been feeding intelligence to resistance fighters, documenting cartel movements and helping coordinate safe passage for families fleeing cartel territory. Samuel's final letter, dated just 3 days before his murder, contained detailed information about a planned cartel raid on the village of Las Cruces. He had somehow learned of Don Emilio's intention to massacre the entire population as an example to others who might consider resistance. The letter contained precise timing, routes, and personnel information that could have saved dozens of lives, but the letter had never been sent. Samuel's death had prevented him from warning his revolutionary contacts, and Las Cruces had been destroyed exactly as he had predicted. 47 people had died because the cartel had discovered Samuel's activities and silenced him before he could complete his mission. Silas sank to his knees beside his uncle's grave. The letters scattered around him like autumn leaves. Everything he had believed about that terrible morning was wrong. The cartel had not targeted their farm randomly. They had come specifically to eliminate a key intelligence source. Uncle Samuel had not died as an innocent victim, but as a warrior in a cause larger than personal safety. The revelation reframed every memory of his uncle's final months. Samuel's mysterious trips to town, his careful attention to local news, his knowledge of cartel movements that had seemed like simple gossip, all of it had been part of a sophisticated intelligence operation. The man who preached forgiveness and turning the other cheek had been secretly waging his own war against evil. Among the papers was a detailed map of cartel operations that made Silas's own intelligence gathering look amateurish by comparison. Samuel had identified safe houses, weapons caches, financial networks, and personal information about key leaders that would have taken Silas years to discover. More importantly, the map showed locations of other resistance cells throughout the territory. Uncle Samuel had been part of a much larger movement. A list of contacts contained over 30 names, each accompanied by location information and personal details. These were Samuel's allies in the shadow war against the cartel, shopkeepers who reported on cartel finances, priests who provided sanctuary to refugees, miners who smuggled weapons to resistance fighters, an entire network of ordinary people who had chosen extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The most shocking revelation came in Samuel's personal journal, where he described his reasons for involving himself in the resistance. His own son, Silas's father, had not died of fever as the family had been told. He had been murdered by cartel enforcers after refusing to sell them information about troop movements during the war. Samuel had spent decades planning his revenge, but instead of pursuing personal vengeance, he had chosen to work towards systematic justice. Hatred consumes the hater, Samuel had written, but justice builds foundations for future peace. My son's death will have meaning only if it leads to the protection of other sons, other fathers, other families who deserve to live without fear. The words cut through Silas like a blade, forcing him to confront the fundamental difference between his uncle's approach and his own. Samuel had channeled his grief into building something constructive, while Silas had allowed his pain to transform him into an instrument of destruction. Both men had lost family to cartel violence, but only one had found a way to honor that loss without becoming consumed by it. But perhaps the most significant discovery was a letter addressed to Silas himself, written shortly before Samuel's death and hidden with the other papers. In it, Samuel revealed that he had always known his activities would eventually be discovered and that his death would likely follow. He had prepared for that eventuality by documenting everything he had learned and creating a plan for continuing the resistance after his death. "My dear nephew," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my work has been discovered and the price has been paid. Do not mourn for me. I chose this path knowing its likely destination, but do not let my death be wasted through reckless pursuit of personal revenge. The cartel's power grows daily, and only organized resistance can hope to defeat such evil." The letter contained detailed instructions for contacting Samuel's network and assuming his role in the larger resistance movement. It also contained a startling revelation. Rodrigo Vásquez, the cartel leader's son, had been secretly providing information to the resistance for over a year. The young man's conscience had been troubled by his father's brutality, and he had been feeding intelligence to Samuel while ostensibly serving the cartel's interests. "Rodrigo is not his father," Samuel had written. "He has seen enough suffering to understand that the cartel's methods are unsustainable. He believes change must come from within, and he may be our greatest asset in bringing down the organization from the inside. Trust him, but trust carefully. His position is precarious, and discovery would mean certain death." The revelation that his primary target was actually an ally challenged everything Silas thought. He knew about the conflict. The clear lines between good and evil, between enemies and friends, had become blurred in ways that made simple vengeance impossible. Uncle Samuel's war was far more complex than the straightforward campaign of destruction that Silas had been waging. As he sat among the scattered papers, Silas felt the foundations of his worldview shifting beneath him. The righteous anger that had sustained him through months of killing was complicated by the knowledge that his uncle had found a better way, a path that led toward justice rather than merely revenge. Samuel's wooden horse lay beside the letters, its unfinished state suddenly symbolic of interrupted work rather than lost innocence. The choice before him was clear but difficult. He could continue his personal war of vengeance, hunting down cartel members one by one until he was inevitably killed or captured. Or he could honor his uncle's true legacy by joining the larger movement that Samuel had died protecting, working towards systematic change rather than individual satisfaction. The cartel had killed Uncle Samuel not because he was weak or innocent, but because he was dangerous in ways they could not combat through simple violence. He had represented hope for a better future, organized resistance to their authority, and the possibility that ordinary people could triumph over organized evil. His death had been intended to silence that hope and scatter his network of allies. Instead, his hidden letters had revealed the true scope of the resistance and provided the intelligence needed to transform scattered opposition into coordinated action. Samuel's death had not ended his contribution to the cause. It had simply passed leadership to the next generation of fighters who could learn from his example while adapting to new circumstances. Silas carefully gathered the papers and returned them to their leather portfolio. Uncle Samuel's compass, hanging from a chain around his neck, seemed to point toward a new direction, one that led away from solitary vengeance and toward the kind of organized justice that might actually succeed in destroying the cartel's power permanently. The Ghost Giants' war was ending, but Samuel Donovan's revolution was just beginning. Uncle Samuel's compass lay warm in Silas's palm as he studied the mountain fortress that crowned the Organ Mountains like a stone crown. The ancient Spanish mission had been transformed by Don Emilio into an impregnable stronghold, its thick adobe walls reinforced with iron plates and its narrow windows converted into firing positions. Getting inside would require more than individual heroics. It would demand the kind of coordinated assault that Uncle Samuel's network had been preparing for years. The resistance fighters gathered in the abandoned silver mine represented everything Samuel had worked toward. Maria Santos had connected Silas with cell leaders from across the territory, men and women who had lost everything to cartel violence but had channeled their grief into organized opposition. There was Juan Morales, whose wife had been murdered for refusing cartel recruitment demands. Elena Vásquez, whose brother had been executed for trying to protect village children from forced conscription. Father Miguel Santos, whose church had been burned with parishioners inside for providing sanctuary to refugees. Each face told a story of loss transformed into purpose. These were not soldiers seeking glory or adventure, but ordinary people driven to extraordinary action by circumstances beyond their tolerance. They looked to Silas not as a leader but as a symbol, proof that resistance was possible, that the cartel's power was not absolute, that justice might yet triumph over brutality. The fortress is strong, admitted Carlos Rivera, a former Mexican army engineer who had been forced to flee his homeland after refusing cartel recruitment. But every fortress has weaknesses. The question is whether we have the resources to exploit them. Silas spread Samuel's detailed intelligence across the makeshift table, pointing to annotations that his uncle had made over months of careful observation. Samuel identified 3 potential entry points. The old bell tower has structural damage that weakens the eastern wall. The water cistern system includes tunnels that bypass the main defenses. And there's a postern gate used for supply deliveries that's only lightly defended during shift changes. The plan that emerged from their discussions was complex but achievable. 3 coordinated attacks would divide the defenders' attention, while a small strike team penetrated to the fortress core where Don Emilio maintained his personal quarters. The operation would require precise timing, careful coordination, and more than a little luck, but it offered the possibility of eliminating the cartel's leadership in a single decisive action. Meanwhile, Rodrigo Vásquez paced the battlements of his father's fortress, his conscience torn between family loyalty and moral conviction. The secret intelligence he had been feeding to Samuel's network had helped save dozens of lives, but his position grew more precarious with each passing day. His father's paranoia had reached levels that made trust impossible, and several close associates had begun to question Rodrigo's commitment to the family business. "You seem troubled." "My son," Don Emilio observed during their evening meal, his eyes sharp as obsidian blades. "Perhaps the pressure of defending our interests has become too great for your sensibilities." The comment carried implications that Rodrigo understood perfectly. His father had always suspected weakness in his son's character, a softness that Don Emilio considered unsuitable for leadership of a criminal empire. Recent events had only reinforced those suspicions, and Rodrigo knew that open confrontation would likely result in his own death. "I am concerned about our long-term strategy," Rodrigo replied carefully. "The ghost giant has inspired more resistance than we anticipated. Perhaps we should consider whether our methods are creating more enemies than they eliminate." Don Emilio's laugh was cold as mountain snow. "Fear is the only language these people understand. Show them mercy, and they mistake it for weakness. Show them strength, and they remember their proper place in the order of things." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Cazador, the Apache tracker whose pursuit of the ghost giant had consumed months without producing results. His weathered face bore the frustration of a professional hunter who had met his match in the desert wilderness. "The Phantom has changed his pattern," Cazador reported. "He no longer operates alone. There are others with him now, many others. They move like an army, not like scattered bandits." The news sent a chill through Don Emilio that had nothing to do with the mountain air. An organized resistance represented a far greater threat than any individual enemy, no matter how skilled or determined. Armies could be defeated, but they could also grow stronger with time and proper leadership. How many? Don Emilio demanded, difficult to say with certainty. Their trail discipline is excellent. They scatter and regroup in ways that make accurate counting impossible. But I estimate at least 30 fighters, possibly more. Rodrigo felt his heart race as he realized the implications. Samuel's network had finally coalesced into active resistance, guided by the intelligence his uncle had died protecting. The ghost giant had become something far more dangerous, a unifying symbol around which genuine opposition could organize. Back in the silver mine, Silas addressed his assembled fighters with the kind of calm authority that comes from having survived the worst that life can offer. "Tomorrow we end this," he said simply. "Not for revenge, not for glory, but so that our children can grow up in a world where strength serves justice instead of oppressing it." The weapons cache that Samuel had accumulated over years of careful planning equipped each fighter with reliable firearms and adequate ammunition. More importantly, the intelligence network provided real-time information about guard schedules, supply deliveries, and the internal layout of the fortress. They would not be attacking blind. They would be striking with surgical precision at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Father Miguel offered a blessing that encompassed fighters from both sides of the border, men and women united not by nationality or language, but by shared commitment to protecting the innocent. "May God grant us courage in the face of danger," he prayed, "and wisdom to build something better from whatever victory we may achieve." The blessing felt appropriate for men and women who understood that they might not survive the coming battle. Several fighters had written letters to be delivered to family members in case of their deaths. Others had made arrangements for the care of children who would be orphaned if the mission failed. These were not reckless young men seeking adventure, but mature adults who had counted the cost and chosen to pay it. Silas spent the final hours before dawn visiting Uncle Samuel's grave, the compass warm in his hand as he spoke to the simple wooden cross that marked his uncle's resting place. "I understand now what you were trying to teach me," he whispered to the desert wind. "Justice isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about building something that makes their evil irrelevant." The wooden horse lay buried beneath the cross, its unfinished state a reminder that some things matter more than individual completion. Samuel's work would be finished by others, carried forward by people who understood that true victory required construction rather than mere destruction. As the first light of dawn touched the mountain peaks, Silas led his fighters toward their destiny. The fortress loomed ahead like a challenge carved from stone and mortar, but it no longer seemed impregnable. It was simply another obstacle to be overcome by people who had chosen to believe that right could triumph over might when guided by intelligence and sustained by courage. Uncle Samuel's compass pointed steadily north, toward the stronghold where Don Emilio Vásquez waited unknowingly for Judgment Day. The revolution that had begun with a simple farmer's moral conviction was about to test itself against the concentrated power of organized evil. Behind them, the mine entrance was sealed and camouflaged, erasing all evidence of their presence. Ahead lay either victory that would free an entire territory from criminal domination, or death that would at least demonstrate that some people still chose to fight rather than submit to tyranny. The ghost giant had found his army, and they were marching toward a confrontation that would determine the future of everyone who called the high desert home. Dawn broke over the Organ Mountains as 3 separate assault teams moved into position around Don Emilio's fortress. The cartel leader's gold-inlaid pistol, the same weapon that had killed Uncle Samuel, gleamed from his hip as he emerged onto the battlements for his morning inspection. Unaware that death was closing in from multiple directions, Silas led the main assault team toward the eastern wall where Samuel's intelligence had identified structural weaknesses in the ancient stonework. His massive frame moved with surprising stealth through the pre-dawn darkness, the other fighters following in his wake like shadows given substance. Each man carried weapons taken from dead cartel members, creating a grim symmetry that Samuel would have appreciated. The first breach came exactly as planned. Maria Santos's team triggered an explosion in the water cistern that sent shockwaves through the fortress foundations, while simultaneously creating a gap in the outer defenses. The blast echoed across the mountains like thunder, announcing to the world that the cartel's day of reckoning had finally arrived. Don Emilio's response was swift but confused. Alarm bells rang throughout the compound as defenders rushed to positions that had been planned for conventional assault, not the coordinated attack that was actually unfolding. His 43 remaining fighters, reduced from over 100, by months of attrition, found themselves facing enemies who seemed to know their exact positions and response. Protocols. Silas's team struck the damaged eastern wall while the defenders were still organizing their response to the water cistern explosion. His war-trained muscles drove an iron bar deep into the weakened mortar, creating handholds that allowed the assault team to scale the wall like human spiders. Within minutes, they had established a foothold inside the fortress perimeter. The fighting that followed was brutal but brief. Cartel members who had terrorized civilians for years found themselves facing opponents who understood violence as a tool rather than an expression of dominance. Every resistance fighter had lost family to cartel brutality. Their motivation was personal in ways that mere employment could never match. Juan Morales eliminated 2 sentries with his father's hunting rifle, each shot placed with the precision of a man who had learned marksmanship, putting food on his family's table. Elena Vásquez moved through the fortress corridors like an avenging angel, her knowledge of the building's layout gained through Samuel's intelligence, allowing her to anticipate and counter every defensive position. But it was Silas himself who became the focal point of cartel resistance. His reputation as the ghost giant had grown to mythical proportions, and seeing him in the flesh, massive, implacable, seemingly immune to the fear that paralyzed other men, created a psychological shock that shattered morale as effectively as any weapon. El Gigante Fantasma. The cry went up from terrified defenders who had convinced themselves that their tormentor was supernatural rather than human. Some threw down their weapons and fled rather than face the legend that had haunted their nightmares for over a year. Rodrigo Vásquez found himself caught in an impossible position. As the battle raged around his father's stronghold, his secret support for the resistance had placed him on the winning side of the conflict, but family loyalty and genuine fear for his life prevented him from openly joining the attackers. Instead, he worked to minimize casualties among the fortress staff, helping servants and non-combatants escape through hidden passages that his father had never suspected existed. The second major breakthrough came when Father Miguel's team succeeded in opening the postern gate, allowing a flood of resistance fighters to pour into the fortress courtyard. The priest himself had insisted on joining the assault despite his advanced age, declaring that some evils were so great that even men of God must take up arms to oppose them. Don Emilio watched his empire crumble from the highest tower of his fortress, the gold-inlaid pistol heavy in his hand as he calculated his dwindling options. Escape was still possible, secret. Tunnels connected the fortress to hidden exits throughout the mountain range, but running would mean abandoning everything he had built through decades of careful planning and ruthless execution. Gather the remaining men in the main hall, he ordered his lieutenant. If these peasants want to play at being soldiers, we will teach them the difference between courage and foolishness. The command represented Don Emilio's fundamental misunderstanding of what he faced. These were not peasants playing at war. They were people who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. Courage born from desperation was far more dangerous than bravery motivated by glory or profit. Silas fought his way through the fortress with methodical precision, his path aimed directly at the central tower, where intelligence suggested Don Emilio maintained his personal quarters. Each room he cleared brought him closer to the confrontation that had been inevitable since that terrible morning when Uncle Samuel died in his arms. The gold-inlaid pistol was more than just a A weapon, it was a symbol of everything. Wrong with the cartel's approach to power. Don Emilio had commissioned the ornate firearm as a demonstration of wealth and status, caring more about appearance than functionality. It was beautiful, but impractical, decorated but unreliable, much like the empire he had built through fear rather than genuine respect. As Silas climbed the stone stairs toward the tower's upper levels, he could hear the sounds of battle diminishing throughout the fortress. Resistance was collapsing as cartel members realized that their legendary invincibility had been nothing more than shared delusion. The ghost giant was real, his army was victorious, and their reign of terror was ending. Rodrigo appeared in the stairwell ahead of him, blocking the path with raised hands but no weapons. "Senor Donovan," he said carefully, "we need to talk before you face my father. There are things you should know, things that might change how this ends." The young man's eyes held desperation but not fear, suggesting motives more complex than simple self-preservation. Silas paused, remembering Samuel's letter describing Rodrigo as a potential ally rather than an enemy. Perhaps the final confrontation would prove more complicated than simple vengeance required. Uncle Samuel's wooden cross, carved from desert ironwood and worn smooth by months of handling, lay heavy in Silas's pocket as he faced Don Emilio Vásquez in the fortress's highest chamber. The cartel leader stood behind an ornate desk, his gold-inlaid pistol aimed at Silas's chest, but his hands trembled with the palsy of a man who had finally met his reckoning. "So," Don Emilio said, his voice carrying the forced calm of someone trying to maintain dignity in the face of inevitable defeat, "the ghost finally reveals himself. You are smaller than the stories claimed, but then legends always grow in the telling." Silas said nothing, his massive frame filling the doorway like a judgment carved from stone. Behind him, the sounds of battle had faded to occasional gunshots as the last pockets of resistance were eliminated. The fortress had fallen, the cartel's power was broken, but the final accounting remained to be settled between the two men who had started this war. "Your uncle was a meddling fool," Don Emilio continued, apparently hoping to provoke some reaction that might give him an advantage. He thought his secret correspondence and amateur spying could threaten an organization that has survived for decades. His death was a mercy. It saved him from seeing how little his sacrifice ultimately mattered. The words were chosen to inflict maximum pain, but Silas had moved beyond simple anger into something colder and more purposeful. Uncle Samuel's true legacy was evident throughout the fortress, in the coordinated resistance that had made victory possible, in the network of allies who had provided crucial intelligence, in the moral foundation that transformed personal vengeance into systematic justice. He died believing that good men could triumph over evil through organization and courage. Silas replied quietly. "Today proves he was right." Don Emilio's laugh held the bitter edge of a man who had bet everything on the wrong principles and lost. "Triumph? You have won a single battle against one organization. There are others ready to take our place, men hungrier and more ruthless than we ever dreamed of being. You have changed nothing except the names of those who will rule through fear." The statement carried enough truth to sting. But Silas had learned from his uncle's example that sustainable change required more than elimination of current threats. The resistance network that Samuel had built would continue operating long after today's victory, providing the foundation for legitimate governance that could replace criminal rule with actual law. Rodrigo appeared in the doorway behind Silas, his face bearing the strain of divided loyalties finally resolved. "Father," he said quietly, "it's over. The men have surrendered or fled. There's no point in continuing this." Don Emilio's eyes shifted to his son with an expression of profound disappointment mixed with dawning understanding. "You," he whispered, "you are the source of intelligence that allowed them to anticipate our movements. My own son betrayed everything I built. I betrayed nothing worth preserving," Rodrigo replied with quiet conviction. "I chose to protect innocent people from the monster you had become." The revelation that his own flesh and blood had turned against him seemed to break something fundamental in Don Emilio's character. The cold calculation that had served him throughout decades of criminal leadership cracked, revealing the frightened old man beneath the facade of power. "Then I have nothing left to lose," he snarled, swinging the ornate pistol toward his son. Silas moved then, his war-trained reflexes carrying him across the room faster than thought. But even his speed could not entirely prevent tragedy. Don Emilio's shot caught Rodrigo in the shoulder, spinning him against the stone wall with a cry of pain and surprise. The collision between Silas and Don Emilio sent both men crashing into the heavy desk, scattering papers and ornaments across the floor. The cartel leader was smaller and older, but desperation gave him strength that surprised even Silas. They grappled for control of the gold-inlaid pistol, each man understanding that possession of the weapon would determine the outcome of their personal war. Don Emilio fought with the vicious cunning of a man who had built his empire through personal violence. But age and soft living had weakened him in ways that no amount of determination could overcome. Silas's hands, hardened by years of farm work and months of desert survival, slowly forced the ornate pistol away from his opponent's grip. "You think killing me will end this?" Don Emilio gasped as his strength failed. "There are networks you cannot imagine, alliances that span continents. My death will only bring greater evil down upon these people you claim to protect." Silas felt the pistol's weight transfer to his control. The same weapon that had killed Uncle Samuel now aimed at the heart of the man who had ordered that murder. Justice demanded retribution, and the opportunity for perfect symmetry lay within his grasp. One pull of the trigger would complete the circle of vengeance that had consumed more than a year of his life. But Uncle Samuel's voice echoed in his memory, speaking words about forgiveness and the importance of building rather than merely destroying. The wooden cross in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, reminding him of values that transcended personal satisfaction. "My uncle was right about one thing," Silas said quietly, lowering the pistol. "Some cycles have to be broken rather than completed." Don Emilio's eyes widened with surprise and perhaps a flicker of hope, but his relief was premature. The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of other resistance fighters, men and women who had their own accounts to settle with the cartel leader. Father Miguel appeared first, followed by Maria Santos and Juan Morales, people whose lives had been shattered by Don Emilio's orders. "Señor Donovan," Father Miguel said formally, "there are legal proceedings to consider. This man should stand trial for his crimes rather than simply disappearing into the desert." The suggestion represented everything Uncle Samuel had worked toward: the replacement of personal vengeance with systematic justice, the establishment of legitimate legal processes to replace the arbitrary rule of criminal organizations. It was harder than simple execution, but more meaningful in the long term. Rodrigo struggled to his feet despite his wound, his face pale but determined. "I can testify about the organization's crimes," he offered. "Names, dates, locations, everything needed to dismantle the network completely rather than simply cutting off its head." The offer represented genuine redemption, a chance for the cartel leader's son to atone for his family's crimes by ensuring that their victims received actual justice rather than mere revenge. 6 months had passed since the fall of the mountain fortress, and Silas knelt beside Uncle Samuel's grave with a new wooden cross in his weathered hands. This cross was different from the simple marker he had carved in grief and rage. It was a work of art created with patience and love, its surface polished smooth and decorated with intricate patterns that caught the desert sunlight like captured prayers. The territory had been transformed in ways that even Samuel's optimistic vision had not anticipated. Don Emilio Vásquez sat in a territorial prison, awaiting trial for crimes that would likely keep him confined for the rest of his natural life. His organization had been systematically dismantled through the testimony of former members and the intelligence networks that Samuel had spent years developing. Most importantly, the vacuum left by the cartel's collapse had been filled not by competing criminal organizations, but by legitimate governance, structures that the resistance fighters had helped establish. Rodrigo Vásquez had proven himself worthy of the redemption his father had rejected. His testimony before territorial authorities had exposed corruption networks spanning multiple states, leading to arrests and prosecutions that would prevent the cartel's resurrection under new leadership. More significantly, he had used his inherited wealth to establish schools and medical clinics in communities that had suffered most under his family's rule. The dead cannot forgive. Rodrigo had told Silas during one of their many conversations about justice and redemption, but the living can choose to build something better from the wreckage of past mistakes. Maria Santos had emerged as a natural leader in the new territorial government. Her combination of intelligence, moral conviction, and practical experience making her an effective advocate for policies that served ordinary citizens rather than criminal interests. The resistance network that Samuel had built provided the foundation for democratic institutions that could govern through consent rather than fear. Father Miguel had returned to his pastoral duties, but his church now served as a community center where former enemies worked together on projects that benefited everyone. Mexican families who had fled cartel territory were returning to rebuild their homes, while American settlers no longer lived in constant fear of violence and extortion. The transformation was not without its challenges. Other criminal organizations had tested the territory's new defenses, but they found themselves facing not scattered victims, but an organized population that understood the importance of protecting what they had built together. The resistance networks that had defeated the Vásquez cartel provided early warning systems and rapid response capabilities that made criminal operations extremely difficult to sustain. Silas himself had found a role that honored both his uncle's memory and his own hard-earned skills. As territorial marshal, he provided law enforcement services that emphasized protection over punishment, working to prevent crime rather than simply responding to it after the fact. His reputation as the ghost giant had evolved into something more constructive. People knew that justice was available to those who sought it legitimately, but that those who chose predation would face consequences swift and certain. The badge he wore had been forged from metal taken from Don Emilio's ornate pistol, transformed through fire and craftsmanship into a symbol of legitimate authority. It was a daily reminder that even the most corrupted materials could be redeemed through proper application of heat and pressure. His cabin, built in the valley below Uncle Samuel's grave, had become an unofficial community center where people brought disputes for mediation, and young men came seeking guidance about alternatives to violence. The wooden animals he carved in the evenings were given to children throughout the territory, small tokens of beauty and peace that countered the harsh realities of frontier life. Each evening, as sunset painted the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Silas would climb the hill to visit his uncle's grave. The new cross stood straight and strong, anchored in stone foundations that would endure long after the man who carved it had returned to dust. Flowers appeared regularly at its base, offerings from families whose lives had been saved by Samuel's sacrifice and Silas's subsequent war. "You were right, Uncle," Silas would say to the simple grave marker. "Justice builds foundations that vengeance can never create. The territory is healing, and children are growing up free from the fear that consumed their parents' generation." The wooden horse that Samuel had been carving during their last peaceful evening together remained unfinished. But Silas had learned that some things were more valuable incomplete than they could ever be when artificially completed. The interrupted carving served as a reminder that life was fragile and precious, that every moment of peace was a gift to be treasured rather than taken for granted. Other carvings filled the cabin now, horses and cattle, eagles and coyotes, human figures representing the friends and allies who had made victory possible. Each piece was crafted with the same care that Samuel had taught him, attention to detail that transformed simple wood into lasting art. The territory's children had begun learning to carve as well, gathering around Silas's workbench on Sunday afternoons to practice the patience and precision that the craft required. Their laughter filled the cabin with sounds that Samuel would have loved, evidence that the peace they had fought for was taking root in the next generation. Rodrigo visited regularly, his transformation from cartel heir to community leader complete in all but the guilt that would probably follow him for the rest of his life. He and Silas had developed an unlikely friendship based on shared understanding of how violence could consume a man's soul and the hard work required to rebuild it into something constructive. "Do you think he would have approved?" Rodrigo asked during one of these visits, gesturing toward the cross that marked Samuel's grave. "Would he have forgiven someone like me for the things my family did?" Silas considered the question while putting finishing touches on a carved eagle that would grace the new schoolhouse in Las Cruces. Samuel believed that redemption was always possible for those willing to do the work. He finally replied, "You've spent the last 6 months proving that belief was justified." The desert wind carried the sound of children playing in the valley below, their voices rising like prayers toward the vast New Mexico sky. Some of those children were orphans whose parents had died fighting the cartel, while others were the sons and daughters of former cartel members who had chosen new lives over old loyalties. All of them were growing up in a world where strength served justice rather than oppressing it. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Silas placed his hand on Uncle Samuel's cross and felt the warmth that desert ironwood retained from the day's sunshine. The wood would cool as night deepened, but dawn would bring new warmth, new growth, new possibilities for people willing to work toward them. The ghost giant had disappeared into legend, his war complete and his purpose fulfilled. In his place stood a man who had learned to build rather than simply destroy, to protect rather than merely punish, to honor the dead by serving the living. Uncle Samuel's revolution lived on in the children's laughter, in the democratic meetings where former enemies worked together, in the crosses that marked not endings, but new beginnings. The territory was healing, and the man who had helped save it was finally at peace.